Welcome to Unlearning Ignorance, a podcast where once a month we discuss a commonly divisive issue and attempt to fairly represent multiple perspectives. We are not experts, nor are we neutral. Our goal is to show an accurate understanding of conflicting sides, in hopes that it will foster civil conversations with an attitude of always learning. But we also want the show to represent you. So every month we will have a response episode where we highlight your comments, emails, tweets, and voicemails, telling us what we got terribly right, incredibly wrong, or something in between. Thanks for listening to this month's episode, where we bring together Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Welcome. Hey, Chase.
Hey, then.
Chase, welcome to Unlearning Ignorance.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here as your random guest for the month.
You know, my random consistent guest.
Yeah. It is actually really nice to have a podcast where it's the two of us each episode versus my other podcast where it's random people every episode. So it's good to be back. Always fun to record these.
So voting. We're talking about voting in America.
Yes. And we are talking about the Electoral College.
Specifically,
the type of voting systems that might be better, might be worse, could potentially replace it. Which, if you listen to last month's episode, our Star Wars episode, we are finishing out the year with kind of topical episodes. So we will have an episode next month that is fitting for this December. Last month, Star Wars was fitting with the return of The Mandalorian. And this month is obviously fitting because we are recording this right before the presidential election. But is the president election on November 3rd the actual election?
We are voting, but the actual vote for president happens in December when your electors choose. So on November 3rd, everybody is going to finish voting because there's early voters. And then over the next week or so, they're going to finish counting. And whoever's party wins in their state gets to choose a certain number of electors designated by the amount of representatives and senators you have in Congress. Those electors will go to vote in December to actually pick the president. And they don't necessarily have to vote for who you sent them to vote for. Though some states have laws that restrict those electors to essentially vote for the people they promised to.
Right. So this is all a reminder that the United States is not a true democracy. Political scientists can argue about what we really are, some sort of federation. Usually just call it a democratic republic.
Mm-hmm.
So the Electoral College is a sort of buffer between the general population and directly selecting our head of state by majority vote, as happens in every other democracy across the world.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting system that helps keep smaller states actually having some sort of say, and keeps the vote out of being decided by the major hubs of population, which when the Constitution was drafted would have been Virginia. This was a way designed by the musical famous framer of the Constitution, Hamilton.
Yeah.
To give the smaller states leverage and to not let the president be decided merely by the people of Virginia, and also out of a sort of distrust for the general population, to add in a safeguard that would put the actual election in so-called safer, more trusted hands. And so, as Ethan and I are about to get into, we're going to kind of pit a few different conversations and arguments against each other about the Electoral College, which has become a really contentious issue over the years, especially these past 4 years, since President Trump became president off of electoral votes, even though he did not win the popular vote. He did not have as many votes as Hillary Clinton did. It was close, but still, if we ran a democracy just like every other country did around the world, then Trump never would have been elected president. So, as always, our primary purpose in this episode, in this discussion, is not to be the experts on this subject, to teach you everything that there is to know about the Electoral College, but rather to present a conversation between me and Ethan that just shows how you can disagree about the Electoral College well, how you can engage amicably in a divisive issue. So the conversation that we're about to have, it is not scripted, but it is structured. It is not rehearsed, but it is researched. So we hope you'll benefit from it as we get into it. And the first question that we're asking is quite basically, is the Electoral College a good thing? I will be taking the side of arguing that yes, it is. And you will be taking the side that no, it's not. Ethan, why don't you jump in?
Well, democracy seems to be what everybody likes, and it seems to have the most direct accountability to our elected officials because they are elected to represent us. Like, we will still have a republic in that we won't be voting on every single issue because who's got time for that? But a direct democracy is how we vote for every other elected official. The senators, congressmen, governors, whatever elected office, the populace directly chooses their representatives. The Electoral College is this like weird pseudo in between, like just another layer of, oh, the president is elected to represent us, but we're not electing. We're electing representatives who we don't even know, whose names aren't even on the ballot. They can go off and not even choose who we tell them to choose. And so this weird, unnecessary extra step. The fact that you can have an election and then 3 months from now, or a month from now, sorry, have a different president than was decided in the election is absurd. Because those rules were created in a time when it was legitimate that you didn't have the most up-to-date information on who was running and what all was going on in Washington, D.C., and it took like weeks for you to get a newspaper from across the state.
Sure.
And so that was good for that time because you were electing people that you actually knew to go and choose a president who, hopefully with them being empowered, would make the best decision based on how they told you to choose.
So essentially what you're saying is by being anti-electoral college, you are pro-direct democracy.
Yeah, it is direct democracy, but it's not even full direct democracy because we're still electing a representative. We aren't saying, oh, get rid of the whole republic, right? We're saying we want to directly choose our representatives.
Sure.
And so it is still a democratic republic. It's just a cleaner democratic republic without all this extra nonsense of faithless electors and misproportioned representation. Yeah, one vote for one person. Everybody's vote's equal.
So, in the idea of everyone's vote being equal, if it was a direct democracy, do you really ever see a president winning besides the president that gets the most votes in California and New York?
Of course. because everybody has an equal vote, so then they have to go to all the major hubs, not just the coasts. They would have to go to big cities because the
The current setup favors the importance of swing states. And so a lot of campaign trails focus on states such as Florida, while leaving the bigger places like LA and New York ignored, because those are generally areas where you know how they're going to vote. Sure.
and Texas.
Yeah,
And Texas.
or Texas, yeah.
So there wouldn't be swing states. There would be swing cities. It would be hubs that were more red and blue. So, I mean, Texas is a good example. You got Dallas right next to Fort Worth. Two big population hubs that are split. Dallas is very blue. Fort Worth is very red.
Sure.
And because of the Electoral College, none of those Dallas people get any kind of attention from the candidates because we're not a swing state. California, same way. They have red. They got a red north and a blue inner cities for sure, but none of those large populations in the north of California get attention.
But the argument that you're making right now is the same argument that could be used about the country as a whole. The point I was making in my first question was, I don't think we would ever see a president other than whoever the majority of Californians and New Yorkers vote for. New Yorkers. Because
New Yorkers.
I said New Yorkers. I did. Because of the vast amounts of population that are focused in on those places that so vastly outnumbers middle America. And I know that this argument sounds generally pro-Republican because middle America tends to be red and the coasts tend to be blue. I understand that. But the whole point of the Electoral College is to remember that we are states united together, and a single state of the USA is more like most countries worldwide than the United States as a whole. The United States as a whole is rather unique. And when a Texan or Floridian or whomever is voting for their mayor, their governor, they're getting that directly. That person is winning based on popular majority vote. That is more akin to these countries worldwide who have the direct vote for their head of state. And it makes sense in this federation of 50 separate states plus DC to have a different system, because it's such a bigger enterprise. It's such a more complicated conglomerate of separate governments and separate bodies. And because of the way that the Electoral College votes are distributed, it actually gives your small states, your low population states like Rhode Island, Vermont, a chance. It gives them a say. Because if you only have one person in the House of Representatives, everyone has two people in the Senate. So every single state is coming into this with at least 3 Electoral College votes, which is a sort of weight that they don't get to have in any other nationwide circumstance besides the election of our president.
Why does every candidate have a position on ethanol? Because Ohio is a sweet state.
Yeah, because of Ohio, because of Pennsylvania, because they're trying to win over middle America.
Those weird
working class
middle states that are kind of split population-wise between red and blue. Those get focused on because they happened to get just enough electoral votes to matter, but also be split politically.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a direct democracy, you would have to appeal. You wouldn't hear about ethanol. You wouldn't hear about these weird things that nobody else in the country cares about, except for one or two little states. And everybody's more serious issues that are concerned by the majority of people would get addressed instead of them going on the glad handing and corn belt to promise them subsidies and constantly prop up those companies to.
Well, I think a presidential candidate should have, views and policies around ethanol. They should have views and policies around farming. Like, just because it's a few small states that are mostly involved doesn't mean that those few small states don't matter, which is still kind of the question. Like, they still matter as, one of the 50 United States of the so-called United States of America.
But for the past, I don't know, 3 decades, they have been the only states that have mattered, and have mattered very much so. They have early primaries, so that shows early momentum for all the candidates. And so all these weird quirks puts a huge emphasis on these smaller states with their small issues, and leaving the majority of Americans, who the president also represents, leaving their issues like, oh, we can think about them later because we choose the president within, I don't know, the first month of primaries, 2 months maybe. And all those big states that are late primaries don't really matter too much. And then even electorally, they don't get focused on because California is painted blue. Texas is painted red. Your votes don't matter as much as those little niche states with their niche issues that less than, I'd probably say, I don't know, 10% of the people in America have those issues, leaving like 90% of the people like out here to fend for themselves and to hopefully pick the right candidate, even though they haven't addressed their issues.
Maybe so.
If you equalize the vote, they have to address have a broader appeal among Americans. Even like the whole visiting and targeting thing, it will disrupt the system enough so that they have to have a broader appeal and not just get a small cabal of electors to do that.
I think to an extent, while that's a sensible argument to make, it is also kind of contradicted by an earlier point you made, that we don't have the issues anymore of information travel speeds. Anyone at any time, anywhere in the country can figure out what the candidates think on any subject, any topic, because while campaigning does tend to make a difference in some of these smaller states, anyone who's actively involved in the political process doesn't need the president to ever campaign in person in their state, in their city. We have it all on the internet. We have, news 24/7 on multiple stations, easy access everywhere. And like the campaign trail, if it did spend more time in New York, California, Texas, still probably wouldn't make that much of a difference.
It's hard to make the argument because all politicians lie, and immediately when they get into office, they break promises. But that being said, not just addressing the issues in the campaign, but addressing them while they're in office. It makes them less responsive to the majority of the population. you could theoretically, because most states are winner take all, you could win with about 30% of the popular vote. If you won key states like Texas, like just the key major
That's
big states.
extremely unlikely, but hypothetically possible.
You're right.
Yeah.
Right. But it's not even like it is politically, theoretically impossible, but you could get those states together and those faithless electors could get there and choose their own candidate if they talked beforehand and pick their own president.
I mean, presently, over 30 states require electoral voters to vote for that state's winner. So I don't think that hypothetical really pans out under the current circumstances. Um, but I think the fact still stands that in the few instances, because it's only ever happened 5 times, in the few instances where the Electoral College results didn't line up with the majority vote, it happened because there were states getting better representation in the Electoral College than they would in a majority vote. And I think that's an extremely important thing to maintain for this very weird thing called the United States of America. And that's not, treating, you don't have to treat the U.S. as some, perfect, spotless government in order to say that. You don't have to treat the Constitution as a perfect political document in order to still recognize that there would be an imbalance between the states if we remove the Electoral College, and that it is a safeguard that was created in the late 1700s for a reason that still is valid today. That there are a few specific states that just completely destroy plenty of other states in terms of population levels.
Right. And historically that has been the trend, but as we've seen with COVID, urbanization might not be all it's cracked up to be. That there are people now moving away from these big urban centers because when a virus hits and everybody's all crowded in, maybe it's a good idea to be not so crowded. And so it may not always look like, oh, urban urban centers are always going to be at least a large part compared to rural America.
Sure.
But there is definitely a move towards more suburb and rural now because of COVID. And so having that, just your vote travels with you across state lines, not mattering, because we are the United States. We are choosing a president to represent the people of the United States of America. And if everyone doesn't have an equal vote, which the Constitution guarantees a lot of equal rights, why would you not then logically extend that to the vote? Now that we are past the ways of traveling by horseback to deliver information, that we have the ability to give everybody an equal vote, why does it matter if you live in the country or the city? Your vote should be equal because you are an equal citizen in the United States of America.
Sure, it's a trying to maintain a proper balance between the equality of the individual and the equality of the states, which is the very hard thing to do when we're talking about these disproportionate population levels. And that's the exact same reason why we have a Congress that's split between equal representation of the states in the Senate versus proportionate representation in the House of Representatives. And it's like that exact mentality that is being maintained in the Electoral College. And the situation that you just explained is actually something that should make particularly the Democratic Party reconsider its disapproval of the Electoral College. And so the Electoral College has had its enemies for basically as long as it's existed. There have been attempts to get rid of it since the 1800s, right? But as is often the case in humanity, the people who are pro-Electoral College are the people who are currently benefiting the most from it. So currently, that is the Republican Party, no doubt. We have seen in just the past 20 years, the first term of George W. Bush and the first term of Donald Trump both happened not because of, popular vote, because of the Electoral College. So yes, Republicans want the Electoral College right now far more than Democrats do. But if the situation that you described actually pans out as you described it, and that the results of the 2020 pandemic lead to the disbursement of urban populations further across America and more remote living, remote working, since urban areas tend to be Democratic hubs, that could spread out Democratic people and, as you said, thus Democratic voting across state lines, and could actually help the Democratic Party have more weight in the future thanks to the Electoral College rather than currently in spite of the Electoral College. Yeah, I think that's a good place to probably pause.
I mean, you're at an impasse. It boils down to, does the president represent the people, or does it represent the states?
Which is a great question. That's a really great question. And the generally speaking, especially considering how individualistic our society is, and only increasingly so in recent years, that to be able to vote directly for your mayors, governors, senators, etc., isn't enough if it's not also our executive.
It's hard to change the Constitution.
It is very unlikely. And so we're kind of, for listeners, we are kind of exiting our mode right now of having positions against each other as we transition into the second main conversation of the episode. And it's worth pointing out here that it is pretty unlikely that the Electoral College is going to change for a lot of the reasons that I was just arguing on behalf of, specifically the ways that it benefits a lot of smaller states. Specifically, there's approximately 14 states that really benefit pretty drastically from the existence of the Electoral College. And you need 38 states to agree in both the Senate and House of Representatives in order for an amendment to be made to change the Electoral College. We are currently in Electoral College 2.0, so to speak. The passing of the 12th Amendment did change the way the Electoral College functions. So for the Electoral College to change is a real possibility, which is what Ethan and I are going to get into next. But to remove it completely would take multiple states to say we're going to give up the advantage and the extra power that the Electoral College gives us in selecting the president. And that's just a very unlikely thing to happen.
Yeah.
So we're now going to switch into a conversation where we're taking slightly different sides. I think if our last conversation was a bit more kind of black and white, this conversation is going to be a lot more gray in between those poles, where we're asking the question, what's the best way to fix or change? And so these different positions that Ethan and I are going to take for this part is going to be him arguing from a place of either replacing or making very big changes to the Electoral College in order to fix it. Whereas I'm going to be coming from a perspective of just slightly amending or tweaking the Electoral College as is.
So that's funny because do you make a big change to heavily favor now the states, or do you make it a change to more heavily favor democracy? It's gonna be a lot of like. Would you say heavily favoring the state would be more tweaking and amending because of how much it favors it now?
So there are different ways of thinking about this, and there are different ideas out there. I even kind of came up with my own idea that I haven't seen kind of written or spoken about out on the interwebs and different places where we researched and listened to podcasts and whatnot. I think that if you look at it from a big scale, you can just get rid of the president completely. Like, that's the biggest change you could make, right? To get rid of the whole presidential system.
Wow.
The more realistic change in getting rid of the Electoral College would be, as you already described, the kind of direct popular vote. But if we look into the more realistic ways in which the Electoral College could be changed, we're looking at the national popular vote, which I think you'll probably be arguing on behalf of. Changing it to congressional districts. The electors of the Electoral College would be voting by their congressional district rather than the whole statewide winner takes all.
Leaning more towards the represented. Yeah.
Right. Or a proportional popular vote, which would be splitting electoral voters per state by how that state voted. So that would be another thing that would probably be more on
which some states already do that.
I think 2 states. So Nebraska,
2 states, Maine, I think.
Maine, I think that sounds right.
Yeah, Maine's always very experimental with their voting. They do ranked choice voting, which that'd be a massive fundamental change.
Okay, so that's a massive change that I think is fascinating. How about you start us there, and we can kind of argue from there.
Oh yeah, ranked choice voting, man. Imagine having multiple elections run instantaneously. Choosing, okay, if all the candidates ran once, you put that candidate, and you want this one. This would be your number one candidate. You put a 1 on that one, then you have, okay, all these rest of them that are left. Who would win for you between them? You put number 2. And then you are ranking the candidates in which you like them most. And if not enough, if the candidate does not, if there's not a majority of people putting them at number 1, then whoever has the least number of highest votes gets taken off the ballot, and whoever had them at number 1, their vote goes down to number 2. And you essentially have like instant runoff elections until you get a majority of people voting for a singular candidate. And that would just fundamentally break up this duopoly that has taken a hold of the Electoral College, where of the first past the post, which is to mean winner take all. If you don't vote for, you get 1 vote. If you don't vote for the candidate who you think has a chance of beating, in your mind, is the worst, most evil person across the aisle, then you are wasting your vote by voting for what we call third-party candidates who don't generally haven't historically had enough behind them to win election, but people can remember
Ross Perot.
oh, Ross Perot. That's who I was thinking of.
Yeah, he won 18% of the popular vote back in '92. The crazy thing about Perot's situation is that if there had been, if you had either like split up the votes, like direct popular vote, or if you had split electoral votes, basically, if Ross Perot had received his 18% of the electoral votes, then no one would have had the 270 necessary to win. Because you have to get that majority of electoral votes in order to become president. And we haven't seen this happen since the early 1800s. But there were 3 instances almost 200 years ago where none of the candidates received the majority of electoral college votes needed. And so the vote actually got pushed to
Congress.
The House.
The House, where each state gets 1 vote. So you could theoretically have a tie.
Yeah. Right. So
very easily.
A really great resource I found during research for this episode was a blog called Politics in Theory and Practice, written by a Duke University guy named Evan Katz. And I point you to that just because he has a really kind of crazy blog post from earlier this year about how Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi could theoretically become acting president under a perfect storm of circumstances. That it actually is possible that Trump and Biden could each end up with 269 electoral college votes, which would then push the decision to House and Senate, which based on those re-elections could also theoretically become even splits. And so if you have this 50-50 split and they're just revoting and revoting and revoting all the way to Inauguration Day in January, then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi would become acting president because we'd be at the standstill in Congress.
Well, that's if the Senate doesn't agree also.
Right. Yes, it would also require a 50-50 split on the Senate. Because I think it's the Senate is voting for vice president and the House is voting for president. And so it would require both sides of Congress to have that split. But theoretically, in a 0 or 0.0001% chance perfect storm scenario, it could happen, which is one of those weird flaws, debatably flaws with the Electoral College.
It's been a weird year, man.
Right. In 2020,
anything could happen.
It's bound to happen.
Yeah. So what's some small tweaks that could be made, Chase?
Right. So, I do like the ranked choice voting system. I think it would help remove issues of runoff voting, which is where you have to vote again and maybe again. Because as we've seen, especially in the past few elections, the direct popular vote has been really, really close. The Electoral College vote tends to be more of a landslide, a very clear victor. On a big scale, our Democrat v. Republican two-party system is coming up with very, very close votes that would really encourage kind of more scandal, more like recounting, more conspiracies about corruption than our current electoral system, which settles things kind of a lot more handedly and only has a few states where the possibility of miscounting is that much of an issue. So one small tweak that could work really well in terms of maintaining the buffer and safeguard that the Electoral College provides while giving people more representation in the electoral vote would be changing it to congressional districts, where because your congressional district is where you get your House representative from. So for every congressional district nationwide, you would have that 1-to-1 electoral college vote, where whomever your congressional district, whoever wins the vote there, that's who your elector votes for. And so when you spoke earlier of Texas, the issue of kind of Dallas and Fort Worth, and the way, Dallas and Houston are these two giant, city hubs that are more likely to vote Democratic, and their vote ends up meaning nothing because the rest of the state votes Republican, and then the state goes all or nothing. Switching to congressional would allow those city hubs and those congressional districts to have their say, to have their representation in the electoral vote.
So do the overall states in this theoretical tweak, do the overall states still have their quote unquote Senate vote, right?
Yes. So this wouldn't change the amount of electoral votes. There would be different ways in which to handle the 2 extra votes that each state has that doesn't align with the congressional districts. So those 2 votes could be designated faithless electors, so to speak. The 2 votes could go toward the majority winner of the state, which would get things a bit more to that kind of state preference model that the current Electoral College has.
So it'd be two statewide, essentially, electors, and then each congressional district gets their own elector.
Right.
Interesting. So I guess that's contrasted by what you talked about earlier, which is the national popular vote, which is a lot of the states are signing this compact, essentially, and that when they get enough states to have electors, they automatically almost create automatic faithless electors, but they're faithless electors to the national popular vote.
Right.
In that whoever wins the national popular vote, no matter how that state voted, their electors would go to the national vote.
Yeah, so this is weird. I kind of hate this. And it's also super interesting. It's almost like this mutiny that's rising up, that ultimately is doing its part to represent the U.S. population. And so it's coming debatably from a really good vantage point. It would basically be a way of circumventing the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And kind of breaking down how the Electoral College is supposed to function in order to guarantee that the Electoral College matches up with the national majority popular vote. And this isn't just an idea. This is something that's actually happening.
Yeah, there are laws on the books, for sure.
Right. So as of this past summer, we have, at least as recently as I've read, 16 states plus D.C. all signed up for this. That's, I think, 196 electoral votes. So basically, this agreement that they're coming to is that once they get 270 states worth of electoral votes to agree to this, then that group of 270 plus worth of electoral votes will vote for the majority winner countrywide, regardless of the majority within their actual state.
Which is an interesting aspect of the Electoral College, because that while what we laid out is that states hold elections and then the party appoints their electors by that. That's how it works now, but that's only because the rule on the federal level at the Electoral College level is that the states get to decide how their electors are chosen,
Right.
and how their electors vote.
Like we mentioned, there's the 2 states that actually do divide up electoral votes based on how the state divided rather than the winner take all.
Right.
There are some states that don't allow faithless electors and others that do. And so, yeah, again, offering states a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of control is exactly what makes this national popular vote movement possible.
Yep. And as soon as it triggers, like, it will go to court for sure. The Supreme Court will have to rule on this. Like, it's not a question in my mind.
Interesting. I haven't thought about that. It doesn't seem likely to succeed because currently every single state that is a part of the national popular vote is decidedly, dependably a quote-unquote blue state. And so this movement is really a reaction to the 2016 election, where Trump won electorally but lost the popular vote. This is a movement by Democratic states, so to speak. That's not a real thing, but it's in this conversation, it's a meaningful distinction. It's a movement by Democratic-leaning states to try to get back the lead that they know that they have in the popular vote, and to circumvent the lead that the Republicans have in the electoral vote, which is present circumstance. And as we discussed earlier, there have always been people against the Electoral College, and that's whoever is least favored by the Electoral College. For example, I bet most independents are against the Electoral College because this whole winner-take-all system, put that on top of our bipartisan two-party system, basically makes it impossible for an independent to ever crack through. And it makes people feel like they're wasting their vote when they vote independent, as mentioned earlier, because of this whole thing. That basically the only way that independents receive a single electoral vote ever is because of a faithless elector. And so if I were making small tweaks to the Electoral College as is, really my main thing would be to make a change that gives voice and gives representation to third-party candidates, especially because if you look back at the framers, if you look back at why the Electoral College was created, it was never supposed to be with this two-party system. The United States was not supposed to devolve into, the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists, the Democrats versus the Republicans. And I think a lot of the problems that people have with the Electoral College is that it's mixed with this two-party system. And really, the framers even expected the Electoral College vote to fail, to not meet the necessary majority, and to have to push the votes to the House more frequently. Like I said earlier, I believe it's only happened 3 times, and all of those were in the early 1800s. And that's really because the two-party system has given a usually landslide victory to one candidate or the other every election.
It's a quirky system, but I mean, it's worked. We've had peaceful. I think what's notable is
Wait,
that
are you on my side now? Did I win you over?
it's accidentally worked for 200 years. I mean, even
you could
people
say that
who want
about
to,
America as a whole. America has accidentally worked for over 200 years.
I think anybody who even wants to abolish the Electoral College because of its obvious flaws has to acknowledge that it has worked for the past 200 years. And the point of it was for peaceful transition of power. I think that can get lost sometimes. That it is insane for a total shift in government of the executive branch to be peaceful, like before 200 years ago. Like kings were beheaded. That's how you transition power
Yeah.
back in the day, man. Like for America's had peaceful transitions of power so many times because of the Electoral College, the democratic republic that we're in, and all the quirks that come
Yeah.
with it. And so I don't think it's I think if you don't give the Electoral College its due, you don't have a chance of changing it or changing people to come to you, changing their minds to come to your side, because the Electoral College has history on its side. I I think of like England, how they talk about they have a monarchy, but nobody treats it like a monarchy, but they're cool with it being a monarchy still. Like they like their democracy, and democracy is the main way their government functions, but they still technically have a queen that owns like everything or something. It's complicated, but
Sure.
it works for them, and they've had peaceful transitions of power throughout their government for not as long as us, but for a good while, like us. And um, to not acknowledge the success of the Electoral College is a mistake. It is fundamentally flawed, and those flaws can be fixed for a modern society, I think. Uh,
Well, yeah,
Whether or
and
not,
we have been fixing those flaws, right?
yes,
And I think if we move into kind of our final discussion point as we end all of our episodes, how can we be friends as people who, very passionately disagree on a divisive issue? How can we be friends? Well, I think for one, people who love the Electoral College or are very committed to keeping the Electoral College can still admit that there are serious flaws and even evils in the past of the Electoral College. Um,
yeah,
there was an extent to which Hamilton designed it because Southern slave owners didn't want a direct popular vote because the Southern states were so filled with these massive plantations with non-voting slaves that would really their population numbers were low,
yeah.
right?
They were very rural, very big plantations, and they had a lot of populace that didn't have voting rights,
Right.
and they
And
wanted to protect that.
it's weird thinking back. Maybe this is just my poor recollection, but my memory of grade school is thinking back to the 3/5 compromise as being a good thing. That like I remember the 3/5 compromise as the United States was on its way to recognizing slaves and recognizing African Americans as being full people. You're almost there. You're 60% of the way there, and we're on our way to not being total crapheads anymore. But really, what that was about was the Electoral College and the House of Representatives. It was about giving the Southerners more weight so that
Yeah,
they would be going to vote based on these larger populations.
they would essentially be getting to vote for the slaves that they
Right.
owned
Yeah, their
with their
vote
voting
would count
power.
on behalf of the slaves because they weren't allowed to vote, but they counted as part of this, as part of the electoral votes that state would receive, which
Right.
fascinatingly became an even bigger, worse issue after the Civil War and after the 13th Amendment. That the 13th Amendment gave freedom and it gave full personhood and it gave actual like one-to-one population status for all these freed slaves.
Yep.
So that actually increased the populations in the South. It increased the voting power of Southerners. And that's why we have like, Jim Crow and all these situations where the Southerners were doing whatever they could to keep these now freed ex-slaves from voting. Yes, the Electoral College has a very flawed history. And so, when I say earlier, from the perspective of a pro-Electoral College supporter, that the reasons the Electoral College was created are still valid, I'm specifically referring to the imbalance of states when some are highly populated and some aren't. There's also this other very real side to which the Electoral College was also created to appease slave owners, which was awful and wrong and is no longer relevant.
Yes.
At least it hopefully isn't. And we still have ways to go. Like, there's still, we see it in the news. There are cases of voter suppression. There are really terrible things that happen in some areas of people trying to keep other people from voting or forcing them to vote in certain ways. But some of that, at least I think the modern version of that, isn't heavily related to the Electoral College, and those same problems would be the same problems in a direct voter system.
Yeah.
So how do you say that we can be friends?
I mean, like I said before, both sides acknowledging the validities and flaws in their arguments, and getting the conversation quicker to the state, who does the president represent, the state or the people? And I think that would, one, get past a lot of the current sides that are standing by your side, because it seems to be like the roots of the arguments that aren't necessarily getting addressed. And so I think getting more to the roots and finding, okay, we're at an impasse, we just have to disagree and we can move on.
Yeah. And I think this is only a highly contentious issue right now because of the 2016 election. It's going to get worse if the results of the 2020 election are a repeat, where, again, Trump wins the electoral but loses the popular. I think that will definitely heighten the circumstances of this conversation and the amount of anger and disagreement that is fueled by it, especially along party lines. But I think it's remember to kind of take ourselves out of the moment, take a step back, and see that only 5 times in American history has the Electoral College yielded a different result than the majority popular vote. So, as you said earlier, it's something that has almost always worked. And I think to try to have a civil conversation about what important is happening when it doesn't, quote unquote, work, and to try to recognize what's happening for the sake of all 50 states when the majority winner loses the Electoral College. That's an important conversation to have, and I think we should be trying to be fair and informed enough that even when we hate the Electoral College and hate what it's done to America and hate its results, to still understand why it exists and why it's doing what it's doing is important.
Yep, I agree. Thanks, Chase. Thanks for talking with me about this. This is one of my pet issues, and
we got through the whole episode without telling you to vote. Thank you for listening to this month's episode, but the conversation isn't over yet. We want to hear from you. What did we get right or wrong, and what's your perspective on the issue? By writing in, your feedback can be featured in the response episode we will publish later this month. Email us at unlearningignorance@gmail.com, tweet us at unignorancepod, or leave a voicemail at 972-885-9574. Again, that's 972-885-9574. And by lending your voice to the conversation, you can help this podcast represent the Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Thanks for tuning in to Unlearning Ignorance, and we'll be back next month with another divisively divisive issue.